It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, newsbreakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Lawmakers and the governor agreed last year to reform the state's education system. Act 73 came in response to an increase of more than 40% in property taxes over the past 5 years, while the number of public school students in Vermont has significantly declined. The issue took up a lot of last year's legislative session. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, 7 Days education reporter Alison Novak explains where the reform effort stands today, particularly after a task force that was supposed to draw up maps of larger school districts that could pave the way for school consolidation suggested last month a different way to move forward and possibly save money. That move drew harsh criticism from Governor Phil Scott and Education Secretary Zoe Saunders. What's next? And what will happen when lawmakers return to the Golden Dome next month? Novak says the future is unclear. First, she talks about her own experience in the classroom before becoming a reporter.
I taught in Burlington at the Sustainability Academy. It was, at that point, Barnes. And it was when Burlington was in the process of developing those two magnet schools. I was there for about 3 years. Before that, I taught in New York City. So that's where I started teaching. I did this New York City Teaching Fellows program. So it was kind of like you commit to teaching for several years in a underfunded, underserved school. And so I did that. And then we moved up here and I taught in Burlington. And then I had kids and decided to get out of teaching.
Why'd you get into teaching?
I guess so after college, I thought I was going to go into journalism. And I went to Duke and I we had a really good daily paper, which I wrote for. And I did an internship one summer at Vanity Fair. That made me a little bit disillusioned about magazine journalism. It was very glossy and very kind of statusy, just not what I wanted. Yeah, then I went to Thailand to teach for a year after college, just kind of on a whim, and enjoyed it and just thought I wanted to do something where I'm actually doing direct service of some kind. So I just applied to this Teaching Fellows program and ended up doing it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it gives you great experience, I think, for doing what you're doing.
Yeah. And my husband's a teacher. He teaches in South Burlington. So he was in advertising and marketing when we moved up here. And then he decided to go into teaching. So he did UVM's one-year master's and now is at South Burlington at the middle school there. And then I have two kids one just graduated high school, one's a sophomore. So I feel like I kind of get school stuff from them as well. So, yeah.
How is Act 73 going to save taxpayers money theoretically?
So the idea is that we would have these bigger school districts and we can operate at scale. It would be, right now we have these very tiny schools and it's expensive because the class sizes are often pretty small. So you might have one teacher for 10 or 12 kids. So the idea would be then if you consolidate, if you have bigger classes, if you have more kids in schools, that you would not need as many teachers. So that's one idea. And then there's this idea that we would have a whole new funding formula called the foundation formula. And so right now, voters determine how much each student is going to get based on voting on local budgets. Under the foundation formula, the state would actually decide how much money goes to each student, with extra money, extra weights for students who cost more to educate, such as English language learners, students who qualify for special education, students living in poverty. And so there would be more uniformity in terms of how much money each district gets. They'd get the same amount per pupil.
I've heard the term foundation formula before. Mm-hmm. It all seems to kind of what goes around comes around.
Yeah, and it's not a new concept at all. The foundation formula is used in many states. I would say the majority of states use a foundation formula. And I think one of the things that Secretary of Education Zoe Saunders said when she was kind of proposing this foundation formula at the beginning of last legislative session was that there's a lot of variation in terms of spending from district to district. So you have some districts that spend a lot less on their pupils than others. And so a foundation formula would increase the equity because every student, regardless of whether they live in Fairhaven or Burlington or Newport, would receive the same amount.
Well, I remember even back to pre-Act 60 when each town voted on their own budget, and that's why the Brigham decision came down, because the Stows and the Manchesters of the world could spend a lot more than the Danvilles.
Right. And so the changes that were made at the state level to try to address those, I think in some ways did, but I think we're still seeing a pretty unequal playing field in terms of school districts that, have an appetite, or voters who have appetite for spending more, and other, school districts where voters will vote down the school budget over and over again until it's, a very kind of meager amount per pupil.
So the idea you're saying is if you consolidate, you need fewer teachers, fewer schools, fewer heating bills.
There's also, I guess, fewer administrators, right? I think that's part of the idea, that you don't have 53 different school districts, or I think actually we have 53 supervisory unions and 119 school districts, something like that. And so I think part of the idea is to limit or lessen the number of administrators. So that would be also a cost-saving measure. But there's the other argument is that consolidation, there's some other costs that come with consolidation. For example, transportation. I think if you're busing kids farther distances, and we already have an issue with bus driver shortages, you're going to spend more money on transportation. Another thing that's been brought up to me is this idea that, teachers get paid very different amounts depending on what school district they're in right now. And so if you were going to combine school districts, you probably wouldn't be lowering teacher salaries, you'd be leveling up teacher salaries. So if you're leveling up, hundreds of teacher salaries, that's going to be very costly. And that would probably cancel out any savings that you would gain by losing a couple of administrators.
What's the argument back to that by people that support this?
I mean, I think that the foundation formula that was proposed by the administration and that Secretary of Education Zoe Saunders presented to the legislature last year, she said that all of these costs were going to be accounted for in the amount of money per pupil. And then there would be some extra grants that districts would receive for transportation and things like that. But I can't remember the exact amount, but in the governor's proposal, it was cutting a lot of money out of the education system in Vermont. And I think people looked at that and said, we don't buy this. We don't buy that if you cut millions and millions of dollars out of the education system, we're still going to be able to provide a quality education. And so I don't think that the administration really sold it to people. And there's a lot of skepticism from Vermonters that, this large consolidation, this very large scale consolidation would actually save money and make the experience better for students.
Okay, but let's leave the second part of that out for a moment. Wouldn't having fewer districts, fewer superintendents just automatically save money?
Well, I mean, I think what I said before about the fact that there's other costs that might come into consideration, like the leveling up of salaries, the transportation, I think those are all things that need to be considered. I also think, there's evidence from other states, including Maine and several other states, that this kind of forced consolidation doesn't often go well. That often, when something is foisted upon people, there could be lawsuits. When there's not buy-in, it's really hard to do something well.
We live here in Chittenden County, and it seems, there's always this idea that there really are two Vermonts. There's Chittenden County and the rest. And I'm thinking to myself, if I lived out in, Cabot or Danville or somewhere, and my kid had to be on a bus for a long period of time, that wouldn't be an appealing place for me to live. Mm-hmm. And if we're trying to get more people to move into Vermont, why would anybody want to move to those kind of places?
Right. And I've written about this before. So I guess it was about a year and a half ago, the Montpelier Roxbury School District decided to close Roxbury, which was a very small school. And, everyone said to me, all the residents of Roxbury, they said, what is our town going to become if we don't have a school as the hub? Our school is the heart of our town. And, people talk about wanting to attract more young families to Vermont. People talk about the importance of rural communities. But then kind of closing schools in those rural communities, what does it do to those communities? And what is it like when you live in a town where your school just sits empty and you have to pass that every day and look at it as a reminder of, how you were kind of forgotten, I guess.
And what is the thought on what would happen to these schools that are closed?
Well, I think a whole nother big topic is school construction and, facilities, because there was a recent study done, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, that showed that Vermont school buildings need something like $6 billion in terms of, to basically make them, in good shape. That we have a lot of failing systems in schools, a lot of failing plumbing. And, these are schools that were built in the 60s and the 50s.
Right.
They're kind of, they no longer, are able to operate well. And so I think that's a whole nother question, right? What do we do in terms of improving facilities? But, I think in terms of this question of what do we do about buildings that are no longer occupied, I know that in some cases, I just wrote a big story about childcare, and there was a childcare program that moved into a old school in Addison that had been closed 4 or 5 years ago. So that's one option. But I think a lot of times, those buildings kind of sit empty, and if the town takes them over, sometimes there's questions about, does the town have enough money to maintain them? So yeah, I think there's a real question about what happens to schools if when they close.
Well, I think you make a good point because, as you mentioned, a lot of these schools are built at the same time. This new Burlington High School is going to be some $160 million. I guess it's now a few bucks less. Mm-hmm. But even, a lot of these schools are built at the same time with the same kind of construction material. And you got to wonder about some of the chemicals or whatever else it is that people were worried about in Burlington. And then the state of Vermont decided just they weren't going to test anymore, that's mm-hmm. how you kind of deal with that problem.
Yeah.
So, I it's a fair question about but, I like this idea. I was wondering, too, if in addition to daycare, you could have senior centers in there, too, and have a mix of older and younger, and everybody would win on that.
Yeah, I think that could be a possibility. But again, when there's not a school in a town and kids are being bused to other places, having to contend with really long bus rides, what is going to draw new families into a town like that? Even if there is a senior center, even if there is a childcare center, if there's not an elementary school, I think there's a very real question of whether people would want to move to a town.
So what do proponents say to that argument?
I think that the governor's plan, he's saying, and the Secretary of Education is saying, that our plan is not to close small elementary schools. But I think people are skeptical of that because when it comes to consolidation, you'd have a school board that then represents a much larger area. And so there is less local control. Decisions are made not necessarily considering the needs of people in small towns. So even if the intention is not to close small schools, I think some people, there's this Rural School Community Alliance that formed last year that is really looking out for the interests of rural schools, small schools. They've had dozens and dozens of select boards and school boards in small towns join. And I think their argument is, if we have these bigger school boards and school districts, the voice of the rural communities are going to get lost, and we're not going to have the control to decide whether a school stays open or closed.
That would seem to be an argument. I can't imagine what the argument is that wouldn't be the case. Can you?
Not really. Yeah, not really.
Let's talk, we hear a lot about the cost of healthcare, which for all of us, whether you're a journalist, whether you're in any profession, but teachers, obviously, healthcare is a big issue too. How big a factor is this? It seems like we hear a lot about that this is one of the big issues.
It's huge. It's huge. I've talked to school board chairs who say the cost of providing health benefits to their employees is one of the major drivers of their budget budgets going up. And that is something that is not addressed in Act 73. And I think that is something that keeps coming up again and again in my reporting, that if we really want to solve this problem of education spending going up and up and up every year, we have to tackle healthcare. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that that is a cost driver that a lot of school districts say is, one of the biggest in terms of why their budgets are going up.
Let's just go back here for a moment. There was this group that was formed a couple of years ago, group of people that looked like they were highly qualified. We're going to study this and then come up with some recommendations. And it seems as though they were kind of cut off at the pass. And then the legislature sort of took over this before this group was going to, it was like the future of Vermont education.
The Commission on the Future of Public Education. Yes, the Vermont Commission on the Future of Public Education. Yes, and several members resigned last year. Both the chair and the vice chair resigned because I think they were frustrated that they were developing recommendations, but then the legislature came back in January and kind of the governor presented a totally new plan for creating 5 school districts, and they felt like their work was kind of just being ignored. And they still are meeting, but their charge and their kind of the scope of their work is much smaller right now. Under Act 73, they were charged with a couple of things, including creating a process for how a school would be closed. So that is one thing they're working on. And so they have a couple of smaller jobs right now, but you're right that they don't have a lot of relevance in the kind of overall education reform discussion right now. They've kind of been sidelined a bit.
And why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, I think that what happened was when the legislature reconvened last January, the governor came out with a plan. And that was the plan to create 5 big school districts. And that was what drove the whole conversation over the legislative session. So even though the legislature rejected that plan, they still kind of took that idea of bigger school districts and kind of scaled it back a bit. And that's why they created this redistricting task force, which I think we'll talk about. But they did let the governor drive the direction of the conversation. And so I think that's the path that the legislature went down, and it kind of prevented them from thinking more creatively or more outside of the box about solutions that would actually reduce education spending, like the healthcare. That wasn't something they were really tackling last session because it became all about bigger school districts.
And cutting and closing schools.
Yes, and creating a new funding formula or foundation formula for funding schools. So, yeah.
And this new formula, is there any change in how it would be funded? Just purely property tax? What's the thought on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of little tweaks, but yeah, it would still be property tax. There was a proposal by the Vermont NEA to do an income-based tax for education funding that didn't really go anywhere. Last session, people have brought that up. I think the Public Assets Institute also had that proposal, but yeah, we're still going with the property tax construct. Yeah.
And there are people, though, that are paying based on their income still today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So
there would still be, it's a slightly different mechanism under Act 73, but there'd still be kind of a rebate for low income Vermonters.
So we talked about money for a bit here. What is the thought on how Act 73 is going to improve the education experience for kids?
So I think, when we think about high schools in Vermont, for example, we have some pretty big high schools, not big compared to the rest of the country, but, big in Vermont, like CVU in Heinsberg, like MMU, like U32. These are bigger high schools that provide a lot of opportunity for students. So a lot of extracurriculars, a lot of sports, a lot of AP, advanced placement, or, other advanced classes. And then we have some very small high schools. In some cases, under 100 students. So, for example, Cabot, Danville, those high schools are part of a K-12 school, and they're very tiny. They're under 100 students. And so you think about the opportunities those students have. Fewer extracurriculars, fewer opportunities to participate in sports, take, interesting classes. And so I think one of the ideas of consolidation is creating more opportunity, especially at that secondary level. So you don't have some students who are in smaller towns who do not get a lot of options and a lot of preparation for post-secondary. And then then you have other students who go to bigger high schools who have very rich opportunities.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Though at the very least, I could be the starting quarterback in Cabot as opposed to maybe in Heinsberg.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the argument against that? What do the rural communities say about that?
I think what you hear sometimes from kids and parents of students who go to these smaller rural schools is they really know my kids. They really provide kind of a very individualized experience. My child feels seen at these schools. They don't get lost. They're part of a community. They feel like they belong. So I think that is often kind of what you hear in terms of why smaller schools actually do benefit kids.
Is there data on that?
I mean, I haven't seen data. One thing that I've been wanting to do is try to get data about kind of where kids go after high school and look at kind of college enrollment rates for students in bigger versus smaller schools. I think that would be really interesting to look at. I haven't requested that data. I'm not even sure the AOE keeps it because I don't know once kids graduate from high school, I don't know how much schools really track where they go, but I would be really interested to know, what happens after high school in terms of students going to bigger or smaller schools, and if they do have like less opportunity if they've gone to a smaller school.
Yeah, it really is an interesting question. I was listening to a podcast recently. It might have been, do you listen to The Hidden Brain?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, they were talking about having kids together in classrooms of different ages and how the younger kids could learn from the older kids, but equally important that the older kids could learn how to mentor younger kids and become, in a sense, sort of teachers, and that there was a skill set that they learned that they wouldn't otherwise. It was really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said for that kind of smaller environment. And, one of the things in Act 73 is class size minimums. And the proposal by the governor called for pretty big class sizes. If I remember correctly, I think it was like 25 in high school, which doesn't sound that big in some places, but in Vermont, that sounds very big. It became a lot smaller in the final version of the bill. So I think it's something like 15 in high school, 12 in elementary school. So they're pretty small class sizes still. So we're not talking big mega class sizes under Act 73. Yeah.
Was there talk about combining grades?
Yeah, I think in the bill, it did say that maybe 2 grades could be combined. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly small schools have multi-age classrooms. I think what becomes a problem sometimes is when you have too many grades. So if you have like a K1-2 all together, it's hard sometimes with a kindergartner or a second grader. Like, they're in very different places. Yeah. So being able to really address their needs becomes difficult.
You want to go back and teach that group right
no,
there.
Yeah.
So the legislature last year, everybody seemed to be with a lot of dissent, but they were able to get the bills through. They then required this group to form these maps to make these new districts, and then it didn't work. So what happened?
So the charge of the redistricting task force was to create up to 3 maps. So I think that's sometimes reported incorrectly. Sometimes people say, they had to, they were supposed to draw 3 maps. The actual legislative language said up to 3 maps. However, they didn't draw any maps. what they did is they came up with several suggestions that were, a lot less kind of top down than what I think the governor was thinking would happen and some legislators were thinking would happen. So I think what is important to remember is what the redistricting task force, which was an 11-member body made up of 6 legislators and 5 people who had experience in the public education system, what they said when they came out with their report, which just came out a couple days ago, is that we did not find any evidence that forced consolidation was going to improve the quality of education for students in Vermont and save money. And so we decided we weren't going to just recommend maps to recommend maps. We were going to go with what the data told us. And so what they recommended was these education service areas. Sometimes they're called BOCES. In New York, they're called BOCES. And the idea is that districts wouldn't consolidate their governance, but they'd share services. So they might share training for teachers and administrators. They might share special education services. They might share computer systems. They might share transportation. They might purchase things together to save money. And in southeastern Vermont, so in the Woodstock area, Mountain Views is the school district there, they are already doing this model, this BOCES model, with 7 other school districts and supervisory unions. And they say it's paying off. They say that they are able to save money. And it's also a way where you don't have to, combine, you don't have to go through kind of this painful process of merging and consolidation. You can still have your own supervisory unions or school districts, but it is a money-saving measure. So that is kind of the primary recommendation of the task force. And what the governor has said and what Secretary Saunders has said is that this is not what Act 73 called for. They called for the drawing of maps, they called for new, larger school districts, and this is a completely different policy construct. And so that's why the governor, or some people might have heard him say that the redistricting task force failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what he means. And Zoe Saunders also has said about these kind of cooperative service areas that it just adds an extra layer of complexity or bureaucracy to the system, and it's not going to solve any problems. So it's really setting up a bit of a battle for when the legislative session reconvenes, because you have the governor and the Secretary of Education very strongly coming out and panning the task force's work and saying, like, you didn't do what you were supposed to do under Act 73. And you have the task force members who many, by the way, voted against Act 73. So it's kind of interesting they ended up on the task force.
Yeah.
And, they were appointed by leadership, legislative leadership. So it's an interesting thing to kind of puzzle over, well, why were people appointed who had voted against Act 73? In a way, it was almost like you might have predicted, if people who were on that task force voted against Act 73, they might not do exactly what Act 73 wanted them to do. So that's just an interesting little tidbit. And yeah, so I think it'll be a battle when the legislative session reconvenes, and it'll be interesting to see if the legislature kind of goes in the direction that the governor wants or tries to take the recommendations of the redistricting task force. So it's the education service areas, these cooperatives is one of their recommendations. They're also calling for voluntary mergers of school districts, which they don't give a lot of detail on, but basically say that districts that want to merge should be able to and should be incentivized. And then they're also calling for larger regional high schools, which would kind of get at what I was talking about, more opportunity for students. However, the problem there is we don't have any money to build or renovate high schools. So I think there's much that has to be done before we can move to these bigger regional high schools across the state.
What was the plan under Act 73 for who is going to decide consolidation?
The redistricting task force was supposed to draw up to 3 maps, and then when the legislature reconvened, they were to take those recommendations and decide which map to go with. The redistricting task force wasn't charged with actually deciding which map was going to be drawn. It was more like they were giving recommendations to the legislature, and then it was going to be up to the legislature to decide which one to go with. But now that there's no maps to choose from, I think that's why we're almost starting back at square one. The legislature is going to have to, if they want to go with these larger districts, they're going to have to draw their own maps now, since they weren't provided to them.
Okay, but when the map came in, who is going to have to make that final decision of we're going to close X school or Y school?
So I don't think it was as simple as just closing the schools. I think the idea was, well, we're going to form these bigger governance structures, and then those school boards are going to decide which schools to keep open. So it wasn't the legislature that was going to decide what schools would close, but it would be once these larger school boards were created, they might realize, you know what, we have redundancy here, or this school really has too few students. And then at that point, they could maybe close a school, but it was not going to be up to the legislature.
What was the response of the two Democratic leaders, the Speaker of the House and the head of the Senate, both Democrats? What was their response when the redistricting, these maps were not drawn?
So they haven't made any public comment about that, but on Monday, the tax letter, the property tax letter was released, which said that we were looking at a 11.9% increase in property taxes.
Boom.
Yes. Yeah. And part of that is due to the fact that we bought down tax rates last year by putting $118 million into the ed fund. So
that wasn't for property taxes.
Right.
Yeah.
So about half of that 11.9% is because of that buy down from last year. But still, it's a pretty shocking number, especially because we've seen property taxes go up and up and up year after year. So the governor, released a statement saying we need to do something about this. This is unsustainable. Feels like something he said before. This is kind of the reason he wants to push for the redistricting. He said we need to do the redistricting because this is unsustainable. And it was interesting because both Senator Baruth and Representative Krawinski, the leader of the Senate and the House, they both came out with statements after that tax letter was released. Basically, to me, it felt like they were saying that they were willing to work with the governor, and they seemed a little more open to reopening this redistricting conversation, because the whole thing about Act 73 is the whole funding mechanism, which is the foundation formula, won't go into effect unless we have new districts. So everything is kind of contingent on drawing the new districts. So to me, the statements from Baruth and Krawinski suggested that they were a little more open to working with the governor. They didn't say anything specifically about the redistricting task force, but I do wonder how supportive they are of the redistricting task force's recommendations, given that there are no maps there.
They're both of their comments seem to be very vague.
Yes, I agreed. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it was hard to kind of pin down what their actual thoughts were, but they did seem to be leaving the door open to working with the Scott administration, I thought.
It felt a little bit like sometimes you get these comments from the Fed chair and people are financial reporters are trying to analyze it. Are they going to cut interest rates? Are they not going to cut interest rates? It was hard to tell whether or not they backed up the group that didn't want to make the maps or they were with the governor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I haven't heard any comments about, praising the redistricting task force. I have heard a number of people praise the redistricting task force. So I think educational leaders who work in the field, superintendents, even the Vermont School Board Association came out with a position paper last week praising what the redistricting task force did and said, it was courageous that they, had a charge, but they went where the evidence led them, and they decided that, they weren't going to do something that they didn't believe was actually going to be good for students. And so we've heard stuff like that from people who are in the field, but, there's a lot of politics involved in this. And I think, my hope is just that the politics don't cloud out what is actually best for communities and for students.
And there's this pressure now with this letter out. No one wants to be blamed for a huge tax increase.
Right. And I think, what the governor is saying, though, is that redistricting is going to somehow solve this tax problem. And I think what critics of the governor are saying is that there are other causes for why education spending is going up. Health insurance, we talked about. The fact that in Vermont, we pay for a lot of social services in schools through the education fund. And those are things that we need to tackle. And those are the things that are going to, get our property taxes down, not redistricting. And I think some people, still who did merge through Act 46, which was the law, I can't remember what year it was passed, but that, consolidated school districts or called for the consolidation of school districts. I think a lot of those school boards and school districts I've heard say, we went through this already and it was painful and it took a long time. Please don't make us go through this again.
Did they save money?
There has not been any report that has come out from the state that has had any conclusive evidence as to Act 46 saving money, which is what a lot of critics of this redistricting plan say too, that, we did this already and there's no evidence that saved money. So why are we doing this again?
Why? So how was it that last year was only 1% increase as opposed to the 12%?
So it was supposed to be, I think, 6%. And then we put the $118 million into the ed fund to deflate it to 1%.
Mm-hmm. Why not just do that again?
We could. I mean, I think in a way it's to the benefit of the governor to not do that, because maybe then that will force, the education reform. That's a cynical viewpoint, but I do think, I just heard this legislative briefing right before I came here, and the JFO, Julia Richter from the JFO, the Joint Fiscal Office, was talking about the fact that the 11.9% is just a starting point. It's not set in stone. There's still a lot that can be done to lower it. And so I think that's important to remember, that 11.9, and also there's variation across the state. That's an average. And so I think the 11.9, we should take that somewhat with a grain of salt, not to say that it isn't upsetting and isn't shocking in some ways, but I do think the 11.9% is just a starting point.
And, to be not too cynical about it, we've seen this horror movie before. It seems as though there have been years in the past where this letter comes out December 1st and it never really winds up being the one that's finally the number that comes out. Yeah,
it's a estimation or a projection. It's not set for quite a while. So, yeah.
All right. So, what are the options here? What do you think the options are for the legislature when they go back?
If the legislature takes the recommendations of the redistricting task force, that perhaps might mean a whole new bill, because it is true that their recommendations are not really in line with what Act 73 is calling for. If the legislature decided to take the task force's recommendations and try to kind of create policy around them, in my opinion, it would have to be a whole new bill, because it's not what Act 73 is all about. If they decide that they want to forge ahead with Act 73, the first step is drawing maps. And so there would have to be a lot of work in the early part of the legislative session to draw maps, because, like I said, everything is contingent on these new districts being drawn. And it's kind of strange, because I almost feel like that's what they were trying to do last year, and then they passed Act 73, so it's almost like back to square one in a way. But I mean, I think those are the two, and I guess then the other possibility is they could do something completely different, but it seems like they have kind of two choices really on the table. Either stick with Act 73, draw the maps, and begin implementation, or decide to go to this shared service model and write a new bill, and that would kind of cancel out Act 73, I guess.
And then you've got talk about politics. I mean, you've got this situation here where you've got the governor out there saying he wants Act 73. There's not enough Democrats anymore, at least as it stands today, that could just put through what they want, like 5 or 6 years ago.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, what I keep coming back to too is the fact that, the redistricting task force, part of their work was trying to talk to as many Vermonters as they could through surveys and public forums, get input about what Vermonters wanted. And by and large, they heard that Vermonters didn't want to consolidate school districts. And so I keep coming back to that because, I don't understand, in a way, if Vermonters are totally against this, does the administration and does legislative leadership still think it's a good idea to push something through that is so unpopular? And also, does it also suggest that there was a messaging problem? Because obviously Vermonters don't want the taxes to go up, but they also don't seem to want bigger districts. So in a way, I think the governor perhaps could have better messaged why we need bigger districts, but I don't think anyone has made a convincing case to Vermonters that bigger districts are going to be better for kids. And I think...
Or save money.
And so I think in that sense, it's kind of like a failure in not being able to sway Vermonters. It doesn't seem that most Vermonters want this. They don't want their property taxes to keep going up, but they also don't want bigger districts. So, that feels a little bit contradictory because something's got to give, right? But it's I don't know. I just keep coming back to the fact, how do you force a change on people when they're fighting tooth and nail against it? Just, I don't know. I don't know, if that's policy that's actually going to work out well.
Or is it a case where nobody wants my school to be closed, but it's okay if they close the school in Alison's district?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean,
that's human nature.
It is, yeah. But I don't know. I haven't heard... The argument I've heard from most Vermonters is not just about their own district. It's about we don't want this for our state. We don't think this is good for our state. But of course, yeah, when it comes to your own local school, I think people fight tooth and nail to save their school. And I think we've seen that recently with, Roxbury. That was a case where the school was closed, but there was a real strong contingent of people who came out trying to prevent that from happening. I just covered something in Worcester last year where they were not even going to close the school. They were just proposing moving a couple of grades to a different school. And the community just went wild saying, no, we don't want to do this. And they were able to kind of fight it. And it didn't end up happening. So I don't know. I just think we see again and again that when people's schools are under threat, they fight for them, which I think does show that people really care about education and they care about, their local schools. So.
And local control.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people want to make their own decisions, which makes me think back to, again, pre-Act 60, when every town raised their own money. They decided what their schools were going to be. But that was a whole idea. Local control, that's a bus that left town 25 plus years ago.
Yeah.
So, I just
And it was found to violate the Vermont Constitution. I think. So, yeah.
Because some towns could just raise a ton of money and have basically schools that were vastly superior to other schools.
Right. But what we see now, though, is I think Slate Valley, which is in, I think that's Fairhaven, southern Addison County. That's a school district that their budgets fail over and over again, every year. And they're one of the lowest spending districts in the state. And that's not fair either, right? Because those students deserve just as good of education as, students in Burlington or Shelburne or Montpelier. So there is still an equity that has to be addressed. I just don't know that people are convinced that consolidation and redistricting is going to do that.
On the other hand, if you have a statewide property tax, which for all intents and purposes we do, because what I don't understand is, so we all vote locally. Mm-hmm. And then I don't quite understand what the motivation is for people to vote know if it's all just going to get dumped into one big pool down in Montpelier and then they carve it up. I mean, if you vote for more here in Burlington, for example, that's not necessarily going to be coming from Burlington taxpayers. That's going to come from everybody. So what's the motivation to not spend as much as you possibly can?
Well, I think voters don't always understand that, number one. And I remember talking to the superintendent at Slate Valley saying she was like trying to give voters the message, like, if you keep voting this down, your tax rate's not even going to go down. Yeah. But it was almost like the principle. She kind of said, like, well, it's just kind of tradition in our town. Like, people just always vote down the first budget. It's almost like you can do better. So I don't know, just maybe part of it's this protest, like, too much spending, and just not having a tolerance for that and wanting the school district to make cuts, even though it might not really even affect their tax rate. It's strange, but yeah.
Well, I mean, some people do that with their employer too, right? And say, no, I don't want that. Let's try again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, not that you ever do that. We'll continue our discussion with 7 Days education reporter Alison Novak in a moment. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Back to our discussion with 7 Days education reporter Alison Novak. One of the other issues that I want to ask you about is this whole conflict that's going on between public schools and private schools. How big an issue is this? You know, one of our colleagues has described this as the Achilles heel for reform. Mm-hmm. Is it that big a deal?
Well, one of the interesting things about Act 73 is it actually really limited the number of independent schools or private schools that can receive public dollars. So there was a provision that already went into effect. So there was a provision in Act 73 that said any school that had less than 25% of its students publicly tuitioned can no longer receive public dollars. So a lot of schools where there are only a couple of kids who were tuitioned, using public dollars, they no longer can receive public money. They can for the kids that have already enrolled, so it's kind of like a grandfather clause, so those kids are allowed to finish. But I think it cut the number of independent or private schools receiving public dollars by more than half. So there's only like 20 or 22 that are able to receive public dollars, including, and no religious schools anymore can receive public dollars, which was something that the legislature had tried to do through other bills. There is a lawsuit now pending about that from Mid-Vermont Christian School, because they're saying that Act 73 in effect discriminated against religious schools. So that is an active case. I do think the independent school question is, even though only 3,000 students in Vermont out of the 80,000 students who are publicly funded go to independent schools, it's a big issue. We saw last legislative session, the chair of the Senate Education Committee, Seth Bongartz, he was a longtime trustee, or actually I think chair of the board at Burr & Burton. And then Scott Beck, who is a senator who works at St. John's Berry Academy, they were very key in the Act 73 negotiations. And I think it became very clear during that kind of last conference committee they had, where they were kind of hammering out the final details of Act 73, they were really looking out for independent schools. And that really rubbed people the wrong way. So it does seem to, even though it's a small percentage of students, it does seem to be a big issue. And I think part of the redistricting, too, is this idea, like, would you retain school choice for the towns that already have choice? And what we've heard, I think, since Act 73 was passed is that people who live in towns that have choice and can send their children to whatever school they want, they don't want to give that up.
Yep.
And so they'll fight for that as well. So I think that will continue to be an issue regardless of what policy direction we go in.
One of the things that strikes me where things stand right now is that, you've got a governor who seems pretty dug in on this, and how he would just say, well, okay, let's try this way that this redistricting committee has decided that we combine services within these particular districts, whatever that god-awful
shared service,
acronym,
the
acronym.
ESA. There's many different acronyms.
BOCE,
yes,
or whatever
BOCEs, yeah.
That how do you, as a politician, say, well, I'm just going to abandon this idea that I've really gone way out over, publicly and said, this is what we're going to do?
Yeah, he's definitely dug in. And I think Secretary of Education Zoe Saunders, kind of as an extension of the governor, because she is serving at his pleasure. She was appointed by him. Like, I saw a memo she wrote to the redistricting task force that just completely, for lack of a better word, trashed their plan. Like, she does not believe that what the redistricting task force recommended should be implemented. She believes, or at least she's pushing for the redistricting, and they are very dug in about it. And so I don't think that's going to change. And so I think the real question now is what the legislature does.
And you've got the legislature, maybe not quite as dug in as what the governor and Secretary Saunders are, but they've got this redistricting committee that has said this is not a good idea. For them to just ignore that seems as though unlikely.
I mean, you would think, again, because, that redistricting committee or task force is made up of 6 legislators who were appointed by the leadership. So you would think like they trusted them to come up with recommendations that made sense. So if they don't listen to them, what is it saying about their confidence in their colleagues? It'll just be interesting to see kind of every legislator is going to have to decide kind of what side they're on for. And I also think if they're listening to their constituents, they're probably hearing that they don't want consolidation.
And they don't want their taxes to go up.
Right. So they are kind of between a rock and a hard place. And some of the solutions or some of the cost drivers, like the healthcare, like those are complex issues that are not going to be able to be solved by the legislature in a session, So it is very tricky. Like, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I do think, every legislator is going to have to kind of make a decision about who to listen to. And I guess it is an election year, right? 2026. So are legislators going to ignore the entreaties of their constituents? It feels like if their constituents are saying, don't redistrict, we don't want this, it might be hard for them not to listen to them.
There does seem to be a potential here that, given there's a bit of a stalemate here, that this could suck a lot of the oxygen out of the room in the legislative session. Fair?
Fair. I mean, I think last session, it was almost completely, taken up by conversations around education reform. And I definitely think we could see a repeat of that this year.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hand Baking Company. Thanks for listening.